Namaste. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk a little bit about using yoga to process difficult emotions, like trauma or grief or anger, anxiety. So let's say, for example, you're studying for a test and you're nervous about the test, and you might kind of sit like this and hunch your shoulders up, and the shoulders will get tight. And that emotion that you're feeling when you do that with your body kind of gets stuck in there. And then when we do a pose like, say, the cobra that opens the shoulders, you might feel some of that anxiety coming up. And so sometimes people will say, every time I do this pose, I feel anxious. And that doesn't mean that you should avoid the pose. It's actually a good thing. It means that you're releasing that emotion. And if you start to think about it and try to think about, where is it coming from, or what kind of story is attached to it, it's like you're grabbing hold of it and keeping it inside. And we don't want to do that. We want to release it. So when you feel that, get out of your head and get into your body and just focus on feeling it, and then let it release. And that will oftentimes relieve even chronic issues in the body, or it can help the mind be a little bit more free as well. So almost any yoga pose, depending on the person, can have this effect. But I think that the deep stretching poses and the restorative poses are especially good for mindfully trying to allow these kind of things to come up and to process them. So I'm going to do the pigeon pose. I know pigeon's not a pose for everyone, especially if your hips are really tight, but it's especially good one for releasing trauma because we do tend to store a lot of that in the hips. So I'll demonstrate that one, and I'll also link a playlist of some restorative poses or some deep stretching poses that you can also use instead of pigeon to do the same thing. Okay, so to set up for pigeon, it's good to have a cushion or blanket that can go underneath your hip. I'm just going to use this yoga blanket. Sometimes a block is useful as well. And you're going to come into downward dog and just take the leg up, kind of open the hip a little bit there, and then bring it forward and rest your shin behind your hands. So I'm doing the left leg, so the left knee goes behind the left hand and the left ankle behind the right hand. And then you want your other leg, the right leg, to be right in line with your hip. So sometimes it has a tendency to go off to the side. You want it straight in line with the hip. You can use your blanket or cushion to make up whatever space there is between your hip and the floor. If you're especially tight in your hips, and let's say you're all the way up here, you could fold that blanket a little bit more, or even put it closer to your knee. So you can come up fairly high and still do this pose. So you put your prop there, and then you can adjust your front shin and bring it forward and see how that feels. If that feels like too intense, then just bend the knee a little bit more. And then we're going to come down on the forearms. And your head can either go and rest on the floor or the mat, or if you need a little bit of a lift, you can use a block or anything there that's going to give you a little bit of height. And you just come down and rest in the pose. So now we're going to continue holding this pose, and as you're holding it, you want to take really deep breaths. So we do that Sukha pranayama breathing into the belly. And just notice you're going to feel some stretching, probably in this hip. Try to let that tension release on your out breath. And you may or may not feel emotions coming up, but just let that tension release. So we're going to hold this. And I suggest holding it for several minutes. We're just going to move through it for now, but I suggest holding it as long as you feel comfortable. And then to come up, you just walk your hands back. We're going to go back to Downward dog, we can move our prop to the other side and do the other side. Lift the leg, bring it forward behind your hand, so knee behind your right wrist, ankle behind your left wrist, putting your cushion under the right hip. And you can bend or straighten your front knee depending on what feels good to you. And then you just come down again on the forearms and rest the forehead. Now another thing that you want to consider in this pose is sometimes people will come into the pose and the shoulders will be, kind of crammed up or hunched up like that. So you want to make sure that your shoulders are relaxed, and sometimes that means taking the elbows back a little. And then you can rest your head where you feel comfortable. And again, we're just going to take deep breaths and relax in the pose. And to come out of it, walk your hands back and just come up to a seated position. So if that pose feels really intense, you might need to do a little bit of hip stretching before you're ready for it. But there's other poses, other deep stretching and relaxing poses that are really good also for this process. Namaste.